All right. That is Lucian. He is a part of this as well. He'll have an occasional part, or maybe two, we'll see. My name is Marc Moorash. I am co-editor of Art Young's Good Morning, which is the resurrection of a satire magazine that sat dormant for 94 years. It was founded by a gentleman by the name of Art Young, who was the best-known political cartoonist in the country from 1900 to 1940. He was an avowed socialist, illustrated for Eugene Debs, and we decided that if he were alive at the ripe old age of 151, there'd be no doubt he'd be illustrating for Bernie. And so last November, we brought back Good Morning and figured, you know what? No one else is bringing it back after 94 years. It might as well be us. So all of the illustrations in the magazine are by that lovely lady back there.
And the baby.
And you'll see a few of hers up here, but also you'll see a whole plethora of folks up here. If the wealthy want war, why don't we poor prefer peace? The history of income inequality and war through cartoons and satire. So we're going to break it into 4 sections. The Great War, World War I, World War Who, and World War 15. So we start, of course, with the Great War, but we're not talking about the Great War, later renamed as World War I, although we are. But it's the war for what exactly? What is the Great War that we're speaking of? This cartoon by Art Young, it's shells that do the job, don't linger, made in America, the best. Made in America, the best shells die the best way.
What's a shell?
Shell is something that explodes, shot out of a rocket. So we are talking about the war for the mind, and that's where income inequality and war and everything we're dealing with 100 years later comes from. This is a whimsical little cartoon of Art Young's proletarian literature versus bourgeoisie literature. I love this cartoon. It's not of anything other than books and pens and torn pages and books splayed open. But it fits what we're talking about, because the Great War, World War I, happened because the American populace was convinced they needed a great war. Now, Art Young was an editor of a magazine called The Masses. He was the art editor. There were a number of folks who worked on it. The other name that someone might be familiar with is a gentleman by the name of Max Eastman. He was the editor of Reader's Digest for 30 years. And the two of them had this magazine from 1911 until 1917, when they essentially got shut down because Art and Max and a couple of other of the artists and illustrators and editors were the very first folks rung up under the Espionage Act.
What's that mean?
So the Espionage Act was, espionage means spying. And so the US government accused Art and the Masses and all the folks working on it for subverting the draft. So when I say Art Young has street cred in the anti-war movement, he has better street cred than just about anyone. Now, they were charged with a conspiracy to obstruct recruiting and enlistment. They were indicted. They went to court. And Art Young, Lucian, was so interested in being on trial for his life. What did Art Young do in the courtroom? He would sleep because he found it to be an utterly ridiculous. That's a drawing that he did of himself sleeping in the courtroom. He drew everybody in the courtroom. It's the drawings of everyone, the bailiff, the people, I mean, you name it. But it's interesting because the Espionage Act from 1917, I'm going to read it to you, and it's going to sound familiar because we hear these same terms today. Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military. What does that mean? It means anything they want it to mean. You do a cartoon that talks about peace, and you're subverting war. Now, it sounds familiar to us because right now we live in a country where war is fairly commonplace. But when we go back to the 19-teens, war wasn't commonplace. War wasn't something that a majority of the country was looking for. We were all looking for peace, right? And there's Uncle Sam in 1915 looking for peace with his bombs and his poison gas stepping across the earth. Now, in 1915, we weren't in World War I yet. It was going on. The president was Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson said, we're not going to war. We're not getting involved in what is happening in Europe. It's not our business. We've had wars. We haven't had a war for a while. We're not going. 1915. Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916. And that is when the World War, the Great War for the minds of the American people, where the term peace became a term to vilify, began. And make no mistake about it, the term peace is a vilified word today. You can be anti-war, maybe you have your reasons. Peace is a 5-letter word on par with Donald Trump's 5-letter P word. Make no mistake. In 1914, we were an all-volunteer army. We had, in this country, can you fathom, a smaller army than almost every country in Europe. Seems astounding when you think of it. 100 years ago, we were not all war hawks. That is a modern-day drawing, obviously.
That's what one of my
Yes.
mom made.
So, 1916, this is a cartoon, not by Art Young, done by Maurice Becker in the Masses. And you have Morgan, J.P. Morgan, Charles Schwab, and essentially DuPont. You don't really see him, but it's the other down there. And Wilson says, but I don't want these weapons. There's no enemy. And Morgan and Schwab et al. Say, you buy the weapons, we'll find you an enemy. This had never happened before. There was no history of corporations leading Congress, the presidency, the government to war. Now, it sounds familiar to us. We talk about this in this day and age, corporations controlling the government. And I've always known this bit of information about the time frame that the Great War, World War I, was the first time the corporations really took control. But as I was researching this talk, I found that, as it usually is, it's actually far more insidious why the corporations led us to war. Now, again, us having a smaller army than almost all the countries in Europe, when the US spent more on defense in 2012 than the countries with the next 10 highest defense budgets. I think it's up to 12 or 14. There's all different reports. Anyhow, we spend more on military than China, Russia, UK, Japan, France, Saudi Arabia, India, Germany, Italy, and Brazil combined. It might be manipulated a little bit. It's kind of tough when you say somebody like Saudi Arabia, because they spend all their money on military, on buying stuff from us. So it's a little strange and all interconnected. So, we got into World War I almost based entirely on this gentleman. This man had the control and the ear of everyone who had money and who was in the government, and you've never heard of him. Hudson Maxim was a chemist. He invented a number of explosives, including a smokeless gunpowder, which caught the ear of DuPont Chemical. Then Hudson Maxim goes on to write a book called Defenseless America. Woo! We're defenseless. There's a big scary war going on in Europe. They're going to come across the ocean in 1916, and they're going to attack our country, and they're going to destroy America. This is what's going to happen. This is defenseless America. But not only are they going to destroy the country, the main object of this book is to present a phalanx of facts upon the subject of the defenseless condition of this country. Possibly, this book may lessen a little the effect of the pernicious propagandism of the pacifists. The pacifists want peace, but you know what peace means? Peace means you're defenseless, and everyone's going to come over here and kill all of us. People who want peace really want us all to die. Pacifism has wringed the nose of the American people and is leading them blind and unknowing to the slaughter. Do you think people believed it at the time?
No.
No, not yet. It's a book. How many people read books? Even back then, how many people read books? This pamphlet got around, and word got out to some very, very important folks, and they created the preparedness movement. Gather dollars from the public to raise a standing army in case the shores of the country were to be invaded. Millions for defense. This is an Art Young cartoon. You can't see it, but he's shivering. There's the big pan that says preparedness. The capitalist, the top hat to mustache, this image of the capitalist that we know eventually as Rich Uncle Pennybags, Mr. Monopoly, while Art didn't do that drawing, that style of capitalist, the top hat, the monocle, the cane, stems directly from Art Young. There he is with a mask that says war down in the beard, and he's got war profits over there, because it's always about war profits. And people bought into the preparedness movement. We'll give money. The poor, who had nothing, gave money to the preparedness movement. We donate $27 to Bernie. They convinced them to donate money to the war movement because the government didn't have the money to raise a standing army. Problem was, very few people wanted to volunteer. The people didn't want war. Go figure. Sounds like a great country to live in. Men wanted. Have you ever wanted to see the world for free around the world? Trying to get people to volunteer. See the world, travel, all these great things. You're poor, you're never going to see the world. Income inequality. Travel. Didn't work. They only got about 70,000 people to volunteer. That was not going to defend the country. The reason it wasn't going to defend the country is they didn't want to defend the country. Recruiting officer, I'm looking for Mr. Thomas Atchison, who has served in 3 wars. The time has come when his country can use him again. Probably would have been in his 60s if he served in 3 wars in 1915. Trying everything they can to get people.
He's probably dead.
Well, by now, yes, he'll be a couple of 100 years old. He'd be a zombie.
I'm talking about like, he's been in 3 wars.
He survived the 3 wars. They wanted him in a 4th. So, these peace people have persistently and resolutely blinked facts. The Peace Congress paid not the slightest serious attention to the matter and instead devoted itself to listening to speeches which favored the abolition of the United States Navy, and even in one case, they're prohibiting the use of tin soldiers in nurseries because of the militaristic effect on the minds of the little boys and girls who played with them. Who said it? 1915. Progressive hero.
Walt Whitman?
No. Progressive hero from the 19-teens. Progressive.
Roosevelt?
Yes.
Will Rogers?
No.
Roosevelt,
Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, okay.
Progressive hero. Warmonger. Progressive hero. Anti-peace. Progressive hero. I still don't get it in this day and age. Just because he founded a 3rd party and split the vote with Taft, and so Wilson got elected. It's very strange. Art did not like Teddy Roosevelt. Found him a bore. Found him boorish. All of the drawings of Teddy are like this. At it again. Warmonger. Yet Teddy Roosevelt survives as a progressive hero. You've never heard of Art Young. It's very, very strange.
He introduced antitrust legislation.
He did. He did some good things, no doubt. But the big one, as you're going to hear, Teddy was very responsible for changing the public mind about getting involved. Anyhow, another cartoon I wanted to throw in just to show Art Young's feelings on Teddy Roosevelt, 1860, the rail splitter. Abe Lincoln, obviously. 1912, the lion killer, Teddy Roosevelt. So, enemies of the United States use pacifists as pawns to make sure that the United States does not spend too much on defense. Remember we were talking about that gentleman who wrote Defenseless America? It caught the ear of Teddy Roosevelt, and they decided to turn it into a film. The first piece of militaristic film propaganda in the USA. Upon its release, the film generated a controversy rivaling that of Birth of a Nation because it was considered to be militaristic propaganda. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the staunchest supporters. Teddy Roosevelt loved it so much, loved the book so much, that he actually convinced a general in the US Army to lend thousands of troops to the filming. And that was how they started getting the ooh and ah factor in the American public. No one had ever seen thousands of troops in battle and film like that before. Teddy Roosevelt said, we have to make this film. We have to defeat the pacifists. We have to vilify them. This is Art Young on modern patriotism. Something tells me I am needed at the front to fight the foe. Because what they did with Defenseless America, turning it into a film, was truly and utterly the first time patriotism rang out like it did in this country. Max Eastman said, we give patriotism or devotion to an unreal idea, a highest seat among the virtues. Someday this will not be so. Someday there will be thousands saying, let us have peace. But if there shall be war, let it be war not of nation against nation, but of men against men struggling to some real end. We are not apprised in the textbooks nor yet in the campaign books, but someday we will be that Thomas Jefferson said, a little rebellion now and then is a good thing. The Masses magazine tried desperately to bring peace to the forefront against the entire US government and the beginning of its propaganda machine. They went around the country and gave 40,000 speeches in 40,000 cities and towns trying to get people to back the war. A gentleman with the last name of Creel in 1915 and 16. The US propaganda machine backed by the corporations began in full swing and goes, here we are 100 years later. The film they made of Defenseless America, the battle cry of peace. Sounds great. Sounds thrilling. The battle cry of peace with the subtitle, A Call to Arms Against War. There's a very famous comedian who says this in a far more succinct manner. Fighting for peace is like screwing for virginity. George Carlin. I think he sums it up best, frankly. So, the film no longer exists. No copies survive, for better or for worse. There's a couple of minutes in the archives at the George Eastman House in Pennsylvania, but it's not digitized, you can't see. That's why we still do a paper magazine, because 100 years from now, it'll still exist. What's on the internet that's just digital, you never know if it's going to survive. But we can go back and piece together what happened around this film based on newspaper archives. So, Maxim goes around giving interviews about this film. And he starts talking about we need defense. The freedom that we have built up in the homes that we have fought for are for us to protect, and we must do that by being prepared to repel any devastator who invades America. We're still really waiting. You can argue 9/11, but we're at a peace conference, so that's a whole other thing. We're still waiting in Defenseless America. There are some cases where the question of preparedness is being made a question of politics. No, it's not politics that we need to defend ourselves. And so the basic plot of the story, Emanon, ostensibly a peace propagandist, but in reality a foreign spy, is the head of conspirators who are plotting the invasion of America. And the news reaches a huge peace meeting at which Vandergrift, one of the other characters, is one of the principal speakers. And in the midst of the meeting, a shell crashes through the building of the peace meeting. Keep an eye out outside, make sure it doesn't happen again. And so because the peace movement, the pacifists, didn't want to raise money for defense, America gets decimated. The scenes of New York and Philadelphia crumbling to dust. It is absolutely panic, hysteria driven. And so what happens when everyone sees this film as it travels around the country? Wilson gets reelected in 1916 on the promise of not going to war. As soon as he gets reelected, he changes his mind. And all of the army that's now being raised, the Selective Service Act of 1917 that comes in because he's decided that we've raised all this money, we're going to spend it. Morgan convinces people to give money to the government to buy weapons from Morgan. It's brilliant. It's horrible.
Yeah.
Goes to the war, the Selective Service Act. We have our first conscientious objectors in 1917 as well. And what was raised as an army of defense just happens to be prepared and funded and armed to go overseas. Art Young and Max Eastman, as we spoke about, rung up under the Espionage Act for subverting the draft. All because a guy made explosives, sold them to a company, and wanted to profit more, and convinced everybody that we should go to war so that his great new explosives can be used against people. They don't teach you that in high school social studies.
That's so you don't get freaked out and go to war.
It's a great country. The munition maker has made us hated in Europe, and now we must buy munitions from him to defend ourselves against that hatred. We just sold $20 billion of arms to Saudi Arabia, who then turned around and used them against Yemen. And one day, if you listen to the rhetoric, it might get you, we don't know. We sell arms to propagate the endless war. So it's World War Who. We go off to World War I, we win, I guess. 2 million soldiers come back. No one's ever dealt with anything on that scale. Hundreds of thousands of injured. And so a trivia question to lighten the mood for a moment. Who illustrated these covers? Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell, of course, is known for the Saturday Evening Post. Pretty Americana, fairly not activist, right? He's fairly straightforward. He illustrated for one other magazine in his time. And the reason he illustrated for one other magazine in his time is he decided to step out and be a little socially conscious. The Saturday Evening Post said, no way are we going to publish this. So thankfully, Collier's, on March 1st, 1919, war hero job hunting. Here's where we start getting into income inequality full bore, because it starts after World War I. You have the poor, they spend their last pennies, they raise the army, they all come back. They were promised that when they got back from the war, all of their jobs would be waiting for them. It didn't work that way. When he went to the World War, April 1917, the boss, it is men like you that make our country great, sobs. Your name will be remembered and cherished by all of us. Now, the same man, the same boss, I never heard of him. And this happened to hundreds of thousands of veterans.
Why did he say that?
Because they didn't want to hire people. They didn't want to spend money. They didn't want to pay folks a living wage. For years, years and years and years, 1919, 20, 21, 22, where are we going with this a decade later? The Great Depression. You know why the Great Depression happened? Is because everyone who got fat off of World War I wasn't sharing it around, and eventually the economy crashed. You don't have people to spend, people don't have any money to spend, you ain't got an economy. Congress, excuse me, gentlemen, can I come in? Big business. Run along now. We were done with you when you declared war for us. Same things we're talking about now. Soldiers came back, fake legs, lost arms. The amount of injuries that came back from World War I was something that this country had never dealt with before. The types of injuries was something had never dealt with before. No one here really knew how to deal with that many folks severely injured from the war. This gentleman selling postcards, help an ex-soldier, the thinker. Would I have been worse off if Germany had won? Selling apples, selling produce, selling pamphlets. Art Young, his magazine Good Morning, he would have the out-of-work soldiers selling copies in Union Square, 10 cents, 15 cents, and he would split the cover price with them 50-50. This is why Good Morning failed after 1922, because he was splitting it with the folks who were out selling it. You can't pay for your paper and your printing and your roof over your head if you're splitting the profits 50-50. But he had soldiers going out selling the magazine. He would donate cartoons to little pamphlets that the soldiers would sell on street corners, anything to try and make a few pennies, because nobody was hiring. Nobody was hiring those who were injured from the war. You did a great thing, you're patriotic, but oh well. This is one of my favorite cartoons that Art Young ever did. The caption is, "Bonus or no bonus, Private McGinnis will have his wooden leg even if he has to grow one." Bonus or no bonus, here's something else I didn't teach you in high school. The bonus army. Happy Veterans Day. In 1924, each veteran was to receive $1 for each day of domestic service, up to a maximum of $500, and $1.25 for each day of overseas service, up to a maximum of $625. The World War I soldiers received less pay when they came back from war than the Civil War soldiers had received, who had received less money than the American Revolution soldiers had received. And while inflation wasn't the same thing then as it was now, you can imagine that's not a lot of money. So by 1924, they finally convinced Congress, you know what we're going to do? Okay, we're going to pay you. So 5 years later, hundreds of thousands of so veterans still out of work. Okay, we're gonna calculate how many days you were overseas or here working, and we're going to pay you. Sounds really great, right? Except for one slight problem. This pay were deferred bonds that weren't going to come up until 1945. We're going to pay you 20 years down the line. Most of you will be dead. No war bonus. Profiteer, candy cane, the war profits. You know, I'm not going to give you any because, you know, the Congress have decided, you know, patriotism doesn't require getting paid. Here's where the continuation of vilifying the peace movement. If you're not patriotic, you're vilified. If you're wanting money to be patriotic, you're vilified. President Calvin Coolidge, May 15th, 1924. Patriotism bought and paid for is not patriotism. He didn't want to give him a bonus. The agreement became, all right, we'll pay it in 20 years. Do you really think they were going to pay it in 20 years? I have no idea. It was a whole thing with bonds and interest and this and that, and this is how we're going to fund it. But Coolidge, thankfully, got overruled. How did he get overruled? Well, in 1932, still battling, still trying to get the bonus money early, 40,000 veterans and their family marched on Washington, D.C. You ever hear about this?
No.
You know what you also haven't heard about is that they set up a Hooverville right across the river from the Capitol. And what you definitely didn't hear about when the Senate decided that even with all of them there marching on D.C. to get the payment moved up, we're talking 1932. It's 13 years after the war now. They still haven't been paid. You certainly didn't hear about the fact that the U.S. police in D.C. were sent to violently remove the veterans. Could you imagine in this day and age, with the way patriotism is now, sending police to try and get police failed. And yes, those are US military tanks in the street of Washington, D.C. Those are US troops in the streets of this country firing on US veterans. You can't let that out. You can't let that history be remembered because it might drive down the recruitment even 80 years later. Those names look familiar. Heroes. Teddy Roosevelt, progressive hero. MacArthur and Patton, World War II heroes. Led their regiments, led their tanks. Burned down the Hooverville, all the belongings, drove out the 40,000 people. 40,000 poor citizens, veterans. And there it is, after Patton and MacArthur and the US military was done with our World War I veterans and their march on Washington. Or as Art Young put it, reducing unemployment. Power of satire. So World War 15, we're here today because we want to talk about change. We want to talk about activism. We want to talk about history, but we want to talk about what comes next. People's Revolution, maybe? But what is the People's Revolution? What are the things we need to get rid of capitalism and war profits, or at least capitalism and war profits from owning our day-to-day life? Soldier in a pawn shop, starving ex-serviceman. What? 10 cents on the medal? They told me this thing was priceless. And all the pennies going to buy war extras. Good old Uncle Sam, fattened by the horrors of war and his whip of wage slavery.
Oh, that's fun.
Who drew this, Lucian?
Mama.
Yeah, your mama drew this. When one is hungry, abundance is not the goal. And this is a message that folks who are against a living wage don't understand. And it is a message we try and get across in our cartoons now. When one is hungry, abundance is not the goal. Abundance means having a lot, having maybe more than you need. Being led by the carrot, our capitalist looks out and sees the farmer, and in a totally subtle thing, there are 14 carrots on that stick. Little touch. He runs off after the 14 carrots, and our worker is very happy to have his one. It should be equal. Right now, you could argue that our worker has one and the fat capitalist has none. It's a way to look at it. What leads people away, astray? Here's an Art Young cartoon. Why? I don't want to see you starve. I need you, meaning I need you, the unemployed workers, to keep my employees from asking for higher wages. And isn't that exactly what we're dealing with now in World War 15, or better known as the fight for 15, a $15 minimum wage. Patriotism. Oh my goodness, a soldier was killed in Mexico, let's go to war. Because, you know, World War I wasn't going to be enough. We had to fight everyone. It's like today, where we have to bomb Syria and Yemen and Afghanistan and Iraq, and we're presently bombing 7 countries. Did you know that? And this note over here, this is back in 1915, is that 40,000 get killed in industry every year, 300,000 get injured. And nobody was saying a thing about the conditions in the factories. Capitalism,
Wine.
the Bill Peach, the worker. He hands over the fruit of his toil on a silver platter and then gets about 1/8 of the juice. Anyone know who this is?
We have a fixed on him by totally on blanking on his name.
Who's your brother named after?
Please?
No. Who's Victor named after?
It's him.
Yes, Eugene Victor Debs, greatest labor movement leader this country has ever seen. Ran for president in 1912, got 6% of the vote, and then the US government threw him in jail. And he ran for president again, he got 1 million votes from jail, because they were afraid he was going to win. Avowed socialist, but socialist when it meant getting rid of child labor and strengthening unions and getting the workers to have workers' rights at the table and being able to make a living.
That's a good one.
That is a good one. And if you ever get a chance to read anything by Eugene V. Debs, be it his speeches or books about him, he is a man who is a just abundance of quotes. We are neither pro-German nor pro-Ally. We are socialists, international socialists, and we have no use, not one bit, for capitalist wars. You can see why they threw him in jail. We have no enemies among the workers of other countries and no friends among the capitalists of any country. The class war is our war and our only war. Distraction keeps us from having a fair share. Distraction keeps us from believing that socialism is a dirty word when it was Social Security and roads and workers and unions. Over the last 25 years, you only hear about unions in the news when your UPS drivers are striking and they rally us all up to say, yeah, those UPS guys, I need my delivery. And they're fighting to make sure that people have a living wage. Propaganda, income inequality, war. Fixing up the soldiers that came back from World War I, the hundreds of thousands who were injured in ways we had never seen. So the fight for 15, soldiers, income inequality. What's one of the reasons that the government might not want to support a $15 federal minimum wage?
They want to be rich?
They do want to be rich, but if you could go to a restaurant and make $15 an hour, why would you go become a soldier for $9.75? Why would you have to rank from private up to an E5 or E6 with over 6 years of service before you made essentially the equivalent of a $15 minimum wage as it stands now? How much money the government would have to spend to keep the militaristic force going. Because this is just the army. Make a pay scale that is presently under $15 an hour. So they'd have one of two things they'd have to do. Spend a whole lot more than 57% of our budget as it is on the military, or realize that people could make a living without the risk of going to war. So the fight for 15 isn't just a fight for a fair living minimum wage. It's a fight to put a dent in the militaristic capabilities of this country. War and income inequality and peace. Spend the money elsewhere. You want to rebuild the infrastructure of this country? There's only one way you're going to do it. You got to stop spending trillions of dollars on war, because you got to spend the trillions of dollars on rebuilding the infrastructure. Sorry, I can't make a place for you, but you see a soldier gets much of his compensation in glory and the thought that he has done his duty. What would the US government do with a $15 minimum wage when more than half of their military would need a pay raise just like that? I didn't do the math, but I have to believe it's an astronomical figure. Commercial break, or a really bad joke. Because like that cartoon, you get your glory out of compensation, but it's changed now. You go places, there are places where you get benefits, but also Veterans Day has become a tool to sell things, like every holiday. But it's very strange. It's become worse than we're not going to pay you because patriotism bought and paid for isn't patriotism. Now we're going to piggyback off of you to sell cars, art supplies, food.
Well, you're not selling food and not supplies. The cars.
How many cars do you want? Like little Matchbox?
I would ask for one car.
Just
I don't-
one?
Yeah, because that's one normal-sized car.
That's enough?
Because I don't have like 6 me's or 15 bottoms.
That is true. You could not sit in a 15-seat car all at once.
Yeah.
It gave you an excuse to say bottom in the presentation, huh? Yeah, totally.
Not so I went.
This boy here stood up in front of 80 folks at a Bernie Sanders barnstorming event last April and told everyone exactly about healthcare for all, and that's why he supports Bernie. He then would also like to tell you that he stood up there and talked about Hillary lying about
the sniper
fire. Anyhow, that's Lucian.
I want the 15.
So,
More than
it's an ongoing dialogue,
line sing,
as it
but
ought to
more
be.
than 15 lines sing about
he
it.
canvassed, he phone banked. It was very good, because that's how we have to start this movement. That's why there's only 100 of us here today, and there should be 1,000, there should be 10,000, there should be 100,000. We start here. We couldn't fit 100,000 in this room. It would be really hot, but it would make a really awesome cartoon. It would be nice. We'll find the space, right? So the fight for 15, also a fight to stop the fighting. Something to think about when people argue, well, you know, I'm skilled labor, and that burger flipper shouldn't make $15 an hour. Yeah, actually you should. Because it's not just about one person or the other person or what you're doing. It can also be about a bigger picture, which is a horrible pun. Sorry, we're a satire magazine. What could you do? So, it's a way to undermine the capitalist system, to undermine patriotism, to undermine institutionalized poverty without having to fight 100 years of brainwashing, because patriotism was born to convince the poor to fight the wars of rich men.
That's even Poor Fish, but we didn't make that one.
No, that's Art's Poor Fish.
Cool.
So, anyone who knows my talks knows that when I say that there's going to be 4 sections, it's a total lie. So section 5, oh, caption my caption. I told you the puns are horrible. So we're going to do some arts and crafts here. We're going to all make political cartoons. Probably going to group up 2 or 3, depending what you want. If you really want to work on one yourself, you're welcome to do that. But I'm going to give a sample just to start. So Ava illustrated this cartoon. We had hoped to use it as a flyer for this event. We didn't, but we illustrated this. You've got a Muslim city over here that's getting bombed, the tanks are rolling in. You've got a capitalist, there's a sign saying destruction, and he's putting up a sign that says prosperity and riches over it. I'm showing you this to give you some encouragement and inspiration on the cartoon we're going to do. We're going to use the fight for 15 as our theme, but I want to show you kind of how this works. So we came up with the idea, and the initial caption was, we need to look at this in a different light. The light, of course, being it exploding and he's covering up the sign. And that was cool. We like that caption, but no caption exists in a vacuum unless it gets cut up on the floor and you vacuum it up and like, well, there goes my caption. I can't remember what the heck it said. So we keep talking, we keep figuring it out. You know, we put out the paper magazine every 2 months. We do a daily post on Facebook. If you're Facebook users, like our Facebook page, Art Young's Good Morning. We do a daily satire. We do conversation. It's really good. It's starting a movement of people who want a better world. So we kept talking about it, and we came up with another caption. One country's destruction is another man's profit. It works as well. You know, they're different things. They give you a different tone. They give you a different feel. I'm telling you this because not only are you going to do a cartoon, but you're going to need to do a caption. And it's amazing how the same images on a page with different words become completely different. But what we finally settled on, and it's in this magazine, is, oh, prosperous white phosphorus. And we went with this because this is the actual Bible quote. Thou anointest my head with oil. Oh my gosh, my cup runneth over. It was perfect. And so this is the one we ran. And if you don't know what white phosphorus is, look it up online. It is a horrible, it is napalm on steroids. Do not look at photos of people who it has been used on. And it's supposed to be illegal. And it appears that the U.S. military helped the Saudis use it in Yemen just recently.
Yeah, we used it in the Battle of Fallujah as well.
Yes. We like to use the illegal things because no one will do anything about it. So there's 3 captions, same picture. So, be satirical. Now, I have 8 sets of materials. There's more than 8 folks. So if you want to team up with the person next to you, someone somewhere else, Lucian's going to help me pass things out. You're going to get an envelope, you're going to get a board, you're going to get glue, and you're going to get scissors. I don't know that I have enough scissors. We may have to go back to kindergarten. You have more?
I've got it.
Excellent. Eric has more scissors. And we're going to work. So we're going to pass stuff out, help pass it around, and then I'll give you a quick instruction, not very much, and then off we go.